Welcome to our next installment of Questioning Christianity. My name's Dan Patterson, and this channel is all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. If you've been following along with our channel for any amount of time, you'll know that the problem of evil, why would a good God let bad things happen, was one of my biggest stumbling blocks to becoming a Christian. My own mother had serious head injuries from a car accident when I was just 9 years old on a family holiday, and that sort of torpedoed a childlike belief in God. And that's a problem that a lot of people share as they experience life, as they look at the world around us. Sometimes it just doesn't feel like this would be the product of an all-powerful and all-loving God. And the whole project of theodicy, then, of trying to explain what reasons might a loving God have for allowing bad things to happen, has been something that Christian thinkers have been engaging with for millennia now. There are a ton of different theodicies out there that Christian philosophers and theologians have developed. And today I have the privilege of inviting on Joshua Sijuwade to explain what is a relatively new contender in this field, to offer his exemplarist theodicy for your consideration. How does it deal with the different layers of suffering? How does it help those who are suffering? That's what we hope to shed light on today in this episode. So it's my honor to welcome on Josh for the very first time to our channel. Hey, mate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan, for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Josh, this is the first time we've actually got to talk in person. I've sent a bunch of comments on things you've posted online, but it feels like I owe you a debt of thanks, because nearly every time I see your name pop up in my social media feed, it's because you've released a new monograph, you've come up with a new metaphysic, you've solved an age-old problem to do with the incarnation or the atonement or the Trinity or something else, just in this whole field of analytic theology. Do you want to explain maybe just what that area of study and academia is for maybe people who are unfamiliar with that phrase?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that. So, yeah, the area that I focused my study on is generally it's called analytic philosophy of religion. And there's different subfields where analytic theology falls into that. And analytic philosophy of religion is the study of the meaning and justification of religious claims using the best tools and techniques of analytic philosophy. So if you take a certain religious claim and you're trying to understand the meaning, what does it mean for there to be a God? Or you might be trying to justify it. Okay, given that we understand what it means for there to be a God, is there a God? And in order to either clarify the meaning or to provide a justification, we use the best tools and techniques of analytic philosophy, which is basically just contemporary philosophy that people might study in general universities. And then analytic theology is a more sort of focused subfield where you're doing the same thing, you're using the best tools and techniques, but you're looking at certain more specific claims. So that might be Christian claims instead of just religious claims. So you might be clarifying the meaning or providing a justification for Christian or Islamic or Judaic claims using the best tools and techniques of analytic philosophy. And so that's, yeah, very big interest of mine. I spend a lot of time thinking about it, a lot of time writing on it. And it's something which I've also found spiritually edifying in a way. And that's something maybe we can speak about as well as we go through this.
Yeah, I would love that. Talk us through how you got involved specifically then in the project of theodicy, and speaking about why would a good God let bad things happen? Was that just an academic interest? Is something that your own experience sort of drove you to wanting to consider?
Yeah, so generally I think it's a question which any person, be them religious or non-religious, will face at some point in time. Given the prevalence of religious belief throughout of history, the history of the world, but also contemporary context that many people are religious, they're going to face a question because they also, with their religious belief, they have the reality of suffering. Either that might happen directly to them or indirectly through watching the news or having a family members, you were saying yourself in your own context, that you're going to be presented with the issue of suffering. Why are there people that suffer in the world? But given that you have within your worldview a belief that there is a God who sustains everything in existence and also has the desire for goodness to be proliferated throughout his reality that he is sustaining, you have sort of a bit of a tension. How can I believe that there is a God who is good, all-powerful, all-knowing, sustains me in existence and loves me, but also he allows me or permits me to go through suffering, or allows people that I love to go through this? So it's always been something that's been on my mind generally. I myself haven't gone through, I would say, a very horrendous sufferings, and I'm grateful to God for having gone through that. Haven't not gone through that at the moment, but it is something which I have seen within reality, and it's something which I'm very open to question with with sort of the belief that I have, because I, as a philosopher, I'm someone who really has the position of, we need to be thinking why we believe what we believe. And if you are someone who has experienced the reality of suffering, or you know of someone who has experienced reality of suffering, it is a question that you cannot put your head in the sand. It's a question that you really need to focus on actually trying to provide a reason for, either for yourself or pastorally for someone who might be going through that challenge as well. So it's just something I believe that I've just always wanted to just come to a place of comfortability in saying that actually I believe that maybe there is a possible reason why God allows this sort of thing to happen. And this is something I think any person who's a theist will want to sort of get to a point of that as well.
Yeah, and I think for maybe someone who doesn't believe in God, or maybe even has this as a major objection, one of the reasons why they don't believe in God, sort of the problem of evil as a defeater for Christian theism,
Yeah.
they might benefit from this because they see maybe the Bible really does have resources to help make sense of this problem. Maybe
Yes.
there are ways that God could be good. And so that's one of the reasons why they might dive into this. But for the Christian as well, the person who does believe in God, has a relationship with God through Jesus, maybe an entirely different reason would be to be prepared for when suffering does come. It may not be a reaction to intense suffering that you start thinking about this problem. It could be because, well, you know, at some point in your life, you are going to face many griefs. And how you think about God and what you understand that suffering is meant, purposed to do in your life is going to have a huge bearing on how you walk through those darker seasons of life. And so I always say to people, even if you're not suffering now, it can be great to think through this ahead of time so that you've got a way of making sense, at least, of the big picture of what's playing out in your own life, rather than being so overwhelmed and shocked at the hardships that come. I'm curious with your own view, before we dive into the particulars on your exemplarist theodicy, to explore maybe just the experience of reading the Bible and the whole Christian story from Genesis to Revelation. As we did previously a stream, maybe last year, with a couple of Oxford philosophers on the problem of evil. And we actually used one, your theodicy is one of 12 that we surveyed in that stream. We looked first at maybe the ambitious nature of a person's attempt to explain God's reasons. How confident do you think the Bible actually unfolds God's reasons for allowing suffering? And there was sort of this sliding scale from what's called a radical skeptical theism on one side, which is like this idea that, you know, we are completely in the dark as to what God's reasons for allowing suffering, versus highly ambitious theodicy, where it's like we can explain every aspect of why God allows bad things to happen, and we've got categories to be able to do that. Where would you place yourself along there? Is your theodicy an attempt just to maybe nullify the defeater and say, here's a possible or plausible reason? Or do you think, actually, no, given what I read in the Christian story, I actually think this is something that really is going on?
Yeah, so I will it's more difficult because as a philosopher you need to be as modest as possible in what you're arguing for.
Well, that's
But
probably a good place to start. That'll go well with the Aussies that are watching this.
Yes. But I would say that there is a burden on the theist to provide a theodicy for all types of evil. That doesn't necessarily mean all instances, but all types of evil need to have an explanation for, because, and I'll just unpack this a little bit and define some terms. So in the literature, there is sort of a divide between something called a theodicy and a defense. And this was sort of brought into, let's say, popularity by the work of Alvin Plantinga, so a very important philosophy of religion, where he was dealing with a problem in one of his early works in the 70s, by an argument that was put forward by J.L. Mackie, who was a famous atheistic philosopher at the time. And he put forward, as a lot of people know, or they would have heard of, the sort of incompatibility issue, or the inconsistent triad, where there is a good God, there is an all-powerful God, but evil exists, and it seems to be logically impossible. And so Plantinga took it upon himself to say, actually, it doesn't seem to be the case that this is logically impossible. Now, for something to be logically impossible, it just means that you are basically contradicting yourself. You're saying one thing is the case and one thing is also not the case. You're saying P and not P. And so when we say that there is a God who is all powerful and all knowing and all loving, we are saying that he can do anything, that he knows of everything, and that he'll be motivated to forward the good within his creation. But then also, if there is evil in the world, and that could be just one instance of evil, then, and that could be something as silly as me stubbing my toe, that is a bad state of affairs. So that is an evil. And so what Mackie was saying is that if there is just one instance of evil, then a God who's all powerful has the power to remove this instance. He's all knowing, he will know of this instance, and he is all good. And so he would not want me to go through that bad state of affairs. So there shouldn't be this evil. However, we have this evil occurring. And so what Plantinga was just doing is that he was putting forward something called a defense, which is just basically a possible reason in which God allows evil to occur. So it's not saying that this is the reason, but it's saying it could be a reason. And that's all you need to show to sort of break the logical tension. Because once you can show that it could be the case that there is an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God, and there is evil as well, then you do not have a logical incompatibility. You don't have a logical contradiction.
So
And
there's no longer a proper
Yeah.
defeater for Christianity
Exactly,
in that sense. Yeah.
Exactly. So that was a defense strategy, but the defense strategy, why it's not as helpful, I would say, at an academic context of the problem of evil, but also pastorally, is because you're giving possible reasons that are not grounded, or they potentially might not be grounded within reality. So I'm not going to go into sort of planting a sort of approach, but he uses terms like transworld depravity. And he also uses the idea of sort of demons being in control of the natural order, so that they are the ones who cause natural evils. So why someone might have cancer is because a demon caused it to occur. Now, a lot of people will say that doesn't seem very plausible, even from a Christian worldview where we affirm the existence of demons. We'll probably say that me stubbing my toe or someone having cancer probably wasn't the cause of a demon. But for the defense to work, that's all Plantinga needed to show. So he was successful in doing that. And so what a lot of people have done at the moment is that they shifted the conversation from the logical problem to the evidential problem. And the evidential problem is just basically saying, given the evidence that we have, so now grounded upon the evidence we have from reality about the types of evils that occur, it doesn't seem that there is a high probability that there is a God. And so now what the theist has to do is not say, I'm just going to give you a possible reason, but you have to give a reason which seems to be grounded upon things that we have good evidence for also occurring within our world. So sort of the transworld depravity and the demon sort of explanation of natural disasters doesn't seem to be grounded upon our evidence of reality. So we cannot use that as a plausible means to explain why there is evil. And so what I would say is that the theists has it upon themselves. If they're going to defeat the larger challenge, the evidential problem, then they need to try and put forward a comprehensive explanation, one which is grounded upon the evidence that we have for why God operates in this way, or the things that the way that the world is like. But also we need to have good explanations for the different types of evil that we have evidence for occurring. And so I would say that I go to the position that I think we can put forward theodicies, and we have it upon ourselves to put forward a theodicy that seeks to explain the wide range of evils that we have occurring within our world. Yeah.
And the wide range of evils might be things like there would be the horrendous evils, the famous sort of system that's spoken about in Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God. So brought out that kind of what looks like on the surface life-ruining evils or meaning-ruining evils, or evils that could not have any redemptive effect that we can see and serve any broader purpose, as well as just everyday stubbing toe kind of evils, but also explanations. And you go into this, and we'll let you dive in one sec, just of the different kinds of people that experience those evils. So it's moral evils, things that are caused by moral agents, as well as natural evils, things that come to us by virtue of being part of the world. But then you've got people like cognitively functioning adults and non-human animals and children or cognitively impaired adults. And so there's a whole lot of categories here that your theodicy needs to be able to try and address, I guess. And so let's maybe dive in then and give as much time as we can to your exemplarist account. I think it was published in 2023. Was it your article?
Yeah, so it's gone through sort of a few developmental phases. So the first development sort of I put forward was the introduction of it in an article which was published by I think Studies in Christian Ethics. So I think it was 2022, 23. So I think around about the time you were saying. And then I sort of further updated it in my first monograph, Analytic Theism, where I have a chapter where I sort of further develop some certain points. But then the good thing is that I've got a monograph. So speaking about further monographs, I've got a monograph that is being published next year, God willing, with Routledge, which will be coming out just dedicated to the exemplarist theodicy, trying to show how it deals with suffering, and then also with the different types of problems of evil arguments have been put forward. So yeah, it's sort of gone through different stages. So if anyone is sort of seeking what my own thoughts are, it's probably going to be this conversation that we're having, because I've updated a lot of things compared to the published work.
Well, I'm so keen to dive into that. We'll make sure that we put links as well down in the show notes after this to be able to connect with you and to connect with the rest of your academic work. Like I said at the beginning, there's a ton in there to dig into. As we're going through this live stream, if people on the various platforms want to lay comments and ask questions for Josh, we might be able to do some questions right at the end. So really appreciate you getting involved. But Josh, let's maybe start with the ground level, because this is about to get technical. But let's say someone's watching who experiences suffering, finds it hard to believe in God. And, I've thought about this quite a bit. I've actually developed my own theodicy called the Exemplarist theodicy. What is your elevator pitch on how to explain that to the average person before we dig into the particulars?
So I would just say that God permits suffering for two reasons. The first reason is that it provides the opportunities for individuals to transform into exemplars. And secondly, he permits people to suffer for them to provide opportunities for others to transform into exemplars. So we have two things here. So God permits suffering, and he does it for two reasons: either to allow people to transform into exemplars through their own suffering, or by them providing through their suffering others the opportunities to transform into exemplars. So either they are going to directly transform into exemplars themselves through their suffering and their response to it, or they might not transform into exemplars, but they're going to provide others with that opportunity to do that. And they will be compensated by God for their role that they've played in enabling others to transform into this. And I'm now going to take my philosopher hat off and be less modest, but I do believe that these two tenets of the theodicy can explain all types of evil once we sort of define and go deeper into what these two tenets are. So just to reiterate, so why God permits evil is because either it provides people with the opportunity to transform into exemplars, or through their own suffering, it provides others with the opportunities to transform into exemplars. So those are the two main reasons here.
Well, let's dig into the particulars, because I think anyone who's maybe familiar with the literature might be having the John Hick soul-making idea in the back of their head. It'll be cool to parse out where some of the real differences lie between what your proposal and just that individual idea of sort of development. So you've given me some slides that I'll chuck up, and just follow your lead. So for the next little while, I'm going to let Josh just wander us through an overview of his exemplarist theodicy. And if you've got any questions that come up as we go, remember, please just do chuck them down in the chat. So let me put this up for you, and I'll let you take the reins.
Perfect. So let's just go to the next slide. I think that will be so I think it's very important at the beginning just to lay the foundation of what we are actually talking about, because sometimes we talk past one another when we're doing our philosophical thinking, and it's good to sort of have a good area of understanding of what we're actually trying to deal with. So a lot of the time we use the term the problem of evil, but what a lot of people actually try to deal with is something a lot more specific than evil. And that is not just at the academic context of trying to see if there is a God given evil, but also personally, when I'm going through a problem, a lot of the time it's actually something more specific than just a general idea of evil. Because an evil is just, at the most basic level, a bad state of affairs. And so again, me stubbing my toe is an evil because that is a bad state of affairs. But we wouldn't really say that it's something which is going to call into question my belief in God at the personal level. Oh, I've stubbed my toe. Oh gosh, there isn't a God. We're not really going to say that. So what we're really trying to deal with is something more specific, which is called the problem of suffering. And suffering is a type of evil. It's a bad state of affairs, but it has a specific way in which we can understand it. And this is quite important that we understand in this way. So suffering is an unpleasant experience that consists of a sensation and an occurrent desire for the sensation to stop. So, for example, if I have a pain in my leg and I'm feeling this pain and I like the pain, maybe, then that is not suffering. Because even though I'm having that first tenet be met, I'm having the pain, the sensation, I'm not having the occurrent. Occurrent means at that time. So I'm not having the desire at that moment for that pain to stop. But if I was having that pain in my leg and I said, oh goodness, I don't want this anymore, and it just keeps on going on, then that would be an experience of suffering because it fits those two criteria. It firstly is a sensation, and it is something that I do not want to continue going on anymore. So it's unpleasant, and it's a desire that I want to stop. I have a desire for it
Does
to
that
stop.
second part, that desire, actually infer some kind of rational, reflective capacity, a higher
Yes.
consciousness, or no?
Yes, it does. And that's why it's important when we go later onto animal suffering,
Correct,
because
yeah.
there's sort of a preliminary that I put forward that's actually very important, I believe, in the discussion, because a lot of atheists will bring up random accounts of animals. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those animals actually require theodicy for the pain that they're going through, because they're actually not suffering. So
Yeah, we'll come back to that.
why I would say that this is a necessary and sufficient criteria. So what I mean by that is the conditions are things which must be fulfilled in order for suffering to occur. These two is because if you just had one of them, you are just going to not really have suffering. You're going to have counterexamples. So for example, if someone goes to the gym, they're feeling pain. If someone's running a marathon, they're feeling pain. But we wouldn't really say that they are suffering in the sense that, oh my gosh, there can't be a God because the person is running a marathon. There can't be a God because I'm lifting weights. That doesn't seem to be the case. But if I'm having let's say an unpleasant sensation, of pain in my head that's just going on and going on for years and years, someone can look at that and say, yeah, they have this sensation and they have this desire for this sensation to stop. And so that desire criterion is very important. And so this was put forward by a person called Michael Brady. So it's called the Desire Account of Suffering. And he's not a theist, he's a non-theist, but he put forward a general idea of trying to define what suffering is. And I do believe that this is important. So yeah, just at the beginning, I just wanted to define the terms. So evil is a bad state of affairs. Suffering is a type of evil. And in order for an experience to be an experience of suffering, it needs to have two things being met. There needs to be a sensation. This could be a mental, physical sensation. And then there needs to be a desire, a current desire for that sensation to end. Yeah, so that's sort of just the basis at the moment. But we can move on now. So that's just sort of laying the basis for the idea. And then just with theodicies, I think it's also just the preliminary level, just for people to understand why there is a need for a theodicy. So theodicy is just providing a possible reason for why God allows evil to occur. But it's a little bit more robust than that. It's providing a possible morally sufficient reason for why God allows suffering to occur. Because anyone could just bring up any reason for why God allows suffering to occur, but it wouldn't be we wouldn't say that it justifies God's permittance of it. So for example, if someone said, God allows me to go through this suffering, this cancer, because he enjoys it. Okay. Now that would be something which we would say isn't morally sufficient. So it isn't a morally sufficient reason why God will allow it, because he wouldn't, being a good being, allow that type of, have happiness for someone feeling pain like that. So you need to have a possible reason, and it needs to be morally sufficient. Now, the key thing as well is the possibility here. So this is where defense and theodicy come together.
Yeah.
So with a theodicy, and I'm working within the framework of Swinburne, so he uses a different sort of framework from Plantinga. But the idea of a theodicy is you're still giving a possible reason, because we're not saying we know with revealed knowledge that this is why God allows evil to occur. I'm not taking that point at all. I do not have unfortunately, I do not have the access to God's intentions in those ways. But the idea here is that we're giving a possible, but the possible reason we would say is plausible. So it seems to be something based upon reality and based upon good grounds. So we have good grounds to believe that God will want to do this type of thing, and also fits with our background knowledge of how the world works like. So it's not going to be the defense like Plantinga gives, which can be just anything that's logically possible, but it's going to be a possible reason that seems to have grounding within reality, within the theistic worldview, and within our background knowledge, and it's going to be morally sufficient. Then the key thing as well is there are different types of theodicies. You would have gone through this as well with your explanation you gave in your other stream. But just quickly, what my theodicy falls into the tradition of greater good theodicies. And a greater good theodicy is basically one that says that God permits evil because it brings about a greater good. So the reason why God allows evil is because there's going to be a good that comes from this specific experience of evil or suffering. However, in order for something to be a greater good, it needs to fulfill two, again, criteria. Firstly, it needs to be necessitated by the suffering or by the evil, and the value of the good needs to outweigh the value of the evil. So an example might help illustrate this again. So if I'm walking through the forest and I see someone cutting someone's leg off, I'm going to look at that and say, this is a bad person. This person is cutting someone's leg off. That's very bad. He's bringing about an evil, an experience of suffering, which is not good. And I might try and stop this person. And before I sort of, bust out my kung fu and try and stop this person, the guy says, no, stop. Do not do that. I'm a doctor. I'm amputating his leg. He's about to die. I'm trying to save his life by amputating his leg so that he will be able to survive. Now, what's happened in that scenario is the same action is there, but the value of the action has now changed because two things have now been attached to the result of the scenario. Because what we've seen now is that there is a greater good that is now being produced by the suffering experience. Yes, the person is going through an evil. He's getting his leg cut off. That's a bad state of affairs. It's a suffering experience. However, it produces a greater good because, number one, it's necessitated. So the good of being alive is the thing that comes about, and it's necessitated by the leg being cut off. And we will also say the good of him being alive outweighs the good of having a leg, or the bad of having your leg cut off. So it seems to produce a greater good. But let's say we change that scenario and I said to you, I came and I tried to stop the guy and he said, oh yeah, the reason why I'm cutting off his leg is because he's tired of shaving his legs and that's why he wants to cut off his leg. Now, someone will look at that and say, that's absolutely crazy. And why that's the case is because even though it produces a good, maybe having hairy legs, it might be whatever, we don't know the person's idea, but maybe that's a bad state of affairs for him. So it's good that he has non-hairy legs. But we would say that the good that's produced by the suffering is not a greater good because it doesn't fulfill those two things. It's not necessitated by the cutting off the leg. You can have the good of having no hair on your legs without cutting off your leg. So it's not necessitated. And secondly, the good of having hairless legs is not as good as the disvalue of having your leg cut off. So even though you have a good being produced, it's not a greater good. So in order for a theodicy in the greater good tradition to work, it needs to be one in which the explanation is centered on a good being produced necessarily by the evil, and also by the good being of a greater value than the evil or the value of the evil act. So that's sort of where I fall in. I don't know if you have any questions, or we can move on at the moment.
No, that's perfect. Great. Let's keep working through.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So we can now go on to the next slide. Then let's have a look here. Okay, so now this is where we get on to what I'm trying to put forward. So my exemplarist theodicy, number one, is grounded upon work by a very prominent philosopher in America called Linda Zagrebski. And she put forward this moral theory called exemplarist moral theory in 2017. And she was defending it for a few years before that. And basically her idea is that the way in which we should understand morality is through exemplars of morality. So instead of us taking a, let's say, deontological approach to ethics, or taking a consequentialist approach to ethics, we need to ground our ethics on exemplars within reality. Instead of there being laws, and instead of us looking at the consequences of our actions, what we know, or how we know something is good by definition, ostensibly, that means, sorry, just trying to not speak too philosophically, but
you're doing great.
Sorry. So what that means is we need to define our terms through exemplars that exist within reality. So if I want to know what is a good, what is a bad, or what is a right, or what is a wrong, I'm not going to go into a rule book and understand this. I'm not going to formulate principles. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at certain people, and these people are what we call admirable people. So an exemplar, defining what that is a most admirable person. And we can list many people within society who have been most admirable people that we look up to. And within the Christian framework, that is the person of Christ. And even at a lesser status than Christ, it is the apostles like Paul who says we should imitate him. So
Mm.
exemplars are things which we already hold to within a Christian worldview. And even Muslims themselves, they would hold to Muhammad as being an exemplar for them. So exemplars are things we hold to within religious context. But what Zagzebski was doing is that she was putting forward this idea that we need to define all of our moral concepts by the actions and lives of exemplars. So instead of me knowing what good is through a textbook approach, I know it through a lived approach. I know what good is by looking at Mother Teresa. I know what bad is by looking at what she doesn't do or how she doesn't act. And so the way in which we ground our moral terms is through exemplars. Now, what I did,
I actually think this was the most intuitive part, if I could interject. This, when I first read your paper and saw the application to this field, I'm like, this just makes sense in how people operate, not only in how we think, like we think good, we always do the moral ladder and certain people at the top and other people at the bottom. Like that's just the way we process morality, this through exemplars, but also it's the way that we ourselves learn is largely off models. And like the hunger right now to be able to have people we can look up to in society. And so young people, men and women, are desperately looking for who's giving wisdom, who lives a life that's admirable, who do we want to pattern ourselves after, who are those mentor figures. This is just the way of things. And in the absence of those moral exemplars, you just end up getting this chaos, and there's nothing that motivates people towards those ends. And so I just found this very intuitive when I read your paper.
Thank you for that. And I think it's a general thing, because even outside of morality, this is seemingly how we operate within other areas. Let's say, for example, sports. So someone might be very big on it depends where you are in the world, the term you use, football, soccer. And someone might look at Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi and say, wow, this is an amazing football player. I want to be like him. And so that person will be exemplar of perfection when it comes to football, or an exemplar of the ideal football player. And so we would look, if you're a budding football player, you would be seeing Messi as an admirable person that you look up to. And so the key thing that Zagzebski was trying to say is that we don't just do this within sporting context. We don't just do this within music, because we do the same thing with our entertainers. We want to be like them. But we do this in morality. We want to be like good people. And that's why we sort of put good people in our sort of schools, and we say we should try and be like them. You know, we try and encourage our students to be like these people, is because they are embodying what it means to be good. Now, the key thing, though, and the last thing before I go on to the theodicy, is the way in which goodness spreads. So Zagzebski was also saying that the way in which people are able to become good like their exemplars is through emulation. So when you admire someone, there is something within you that motivates you to emulate that person. So if I admire, for example, Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi, then I'm going to emulate their lifestyle, maybe their diets, maybe their training regime, the stuff that they do. I'm going to try and be like them. Maybe I'll even wear the same type of boots that they wear, that or cleats if you're in America. I'll try and be like them in every way. And so the idea here is that you have a most admirable person, that's an exemplar, and the way in which you try and become like them is through emulation. You admire them and you try to emulate them. And through many, let's say, many trials and tribulations of that emulation sort of process, you will come very close to being like them. Now, football sort of fails, because if you just don't have the skill, you don't have the skill. I could try and emulate Messi as much as possible. I just won't be like him. But I'll be closer to being like him than someone who didn't try to emulate him. But when it comes to goodness, we can actually become good like people, like the people that we admire, by emulating their lifestyle. So the way in which goodness spreads around the world is through emulation. We admire people who are exemplars. They embody virtuous characters, and then we try and be like them by their emulation. Now, what I was then trying to bring forward as an original take was, firstly, applying this within the context of the problem of evil, the problem of suffering. And I was working within sort of what I was saying to you at the beginning, how philosophy of religion is done. You use the best tools and techniques of analytic philosophy. So that was exemplarist moral theory. And then you apply it, or you utilize it to clarify the meaning and justification of a claim. And the claim here is God permits evil for a greater good. And now I'm using exemplarism to sort of show why that is the case. And so what I try and say is that, well, why would God permit suffering? Okay, now there's many reasons why people have put forward. Now, one of the main reasons that a lot of people put forward is free will. there is a free will aspect to what is within my theory, but it's not based upon free will. But my main idea was saying I do believe exemplarism is something that's grounded within reality. We seem to operate in a moral or non-moral context through an exemplarist sort of framework. We admire people and we try to be like them. And so maybe then God has this within his ideas when he allows and permits suffering to occur in our world. And so what I then say, as anyone that's looking at the PowerPoint, I say at the beginning that God permits suffering in order to enable, firstly, the transformation through the process of going through suffering. So the transformation of an individual into an exemplar, or providing opportunities for others to transform into exemplars. So why God will allow suffering is because that's the thing that allows people to actually become exemplars of morality. And if they themselves fail to do that for whatever reason, maybe they die before the process is completed, or something occurs that they don't have the mental capacity, then the suffering that they are going through is going to allow others who can complete the process to be able to then become exemplars. And so there's the primary function is the transformation, and then the secondary function is the providing of the opportunities for others. But I do say now, and I'm not going to go in depth in this sort of stream, but there is a compensatory act here, that it's not just God is using people for the benefit of others, even though he has a right to do that as God, but he's also going to, because of in his perfect goodness, he will compensate these people in the afterlife for their role that they played in providing others with this great opportunity to become exemplars of morality. Can we just move to the next slide, and then we'll jump to animal suffering, because I'm not going to sorry, 1 second, let me just have a look here. We can actually move to the next one again. Yeah, and sorry, just one more.
All good.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So what I want people to do now is try and understand, if we can, as much as possible, with humility of a created being, but try and just understand from a God's eye perspective the type of worlds that God will create. So let's just say that we take a step back and we say, okay, God is now deliberating about which type of world he's going to bring about. And we're talking about our world. And let's say he's decided, as he would, that he's going to create the world ex nihilo. He's going to create the world out of nothing, and it's going to be solely his doing through his word, his son, and by the work of the Spirit, he's going to bring about the world. Okay, and that's going to be his work. But then God has a choice. He can either create a world where the type of world, axiologically, that means the way in which the world is morally, is going to be solely determined by him. That means that he's going to, for example, write in the sky the 10 commandments, and everyone is going to know how to be good from reading the 10 commandments in the sky. Or he's going to implant it in our minds, and we're going to know from our birth, this is how I need to live. And so he's going to make sure that the world is good from his own doing and his own doing alone. And that, if anyone's looking at the PowerPoint, that's the image on the left. That is where God is allowing people to become good through his own means, through writing a moral law in the world, and then everyone being good because of that. So God could do that. But then there's a second option that God could take. God could say that I'm going to be the one who creates the world physically, but I'm going to allow my creation to participate in some way in my creative act. And that is, I'm not going to allow them to create the world physically themselves. That's going to be my doing. But I'm going to allow them to create the world axiologically. I'm going to be the one who's going to allow them to be the ground epistemically of what it means to be good, and the ones who spread goodness around the world. So the way that this works is that God is going to say, sort of through an exemplarist framework, is that I'm going to create a world where people are going to go through certain experiences, which is, if they respond to it in a certain way, they are going to become good people. They're going to become exemplars. And through their exemplary lives, other people are going to look to them and say, wow, this is someone I want to be like. And they themselves are going to emulate them and try to be good, and thus over time themselves become exemplars. And so on and so forth. This is going to go like a wildfire. One person becomes an exemplar, lives a good life, others emulate, they become exemplars, they live a good life, others emulate. And so the way that goodness spreads around the world is not because God himself has just endowed goodness within us from the beginning, and that's how we are to live, sort of like robots, but it's actually going to be because God has given us the abilities to respond to our world in a way that we become good. And then through our life and teaching, we spread goodness around the world. And so the way the world becomes good is through our own work. And so we become co-creators with God through our exemplary lives. And so I believe that the world is more valuable, the one in which we can become co-creators and also in a Christian context, be participators in the divine nature. So in the Orthodox, I'm Orthodox, and we use the term, and others do as well, of theosis, that we are able to participate in the essence of God, but also in his work, that we are able to participate as co-creators with God in the type of world that the world is going to be like. We, through our exemplary lives, by grounding morality, so we ground what it means to be good by our exemplarist life, and we also spread goodness through our exemplarist lives, we are able to make the world into a good world. And so I call this the good of creative flourishing. God wants us to live flourishing lives creatively. And so that is the exact good that is produced by suffering. The good that suffering that comes about from suffering is the ability to creatively flourish. And that means to live as an exemplar and ground morality and spread goodness around the world. And so this is where the sort of the beginning stage comes, is why would God use this process? Because it's a valuable process, and more valuable than God taking it upon himself to be the sole creator of things, physically, materially, but also axiologically. Yeah. I
Appreciate appreciate
know.
that. No, I think maybe what would be helpful here, and I really appreciate you laying that out, would be to then ask a bunch of questions about how this applies to certain parts of both of the Christian story and then certain dimensions maybe of the problem of evil and nature of evils, like animal suffering and others. But maybe can we just come back to the start? Because I know there's been a couple of comments in the chat so far that are curious about how this ties into the origins of evil. So obviously this might be like a greater good as to why God may permit suffering to take place. But what part of your theodicy speaks to what is the origins, at least of moral evil in the human experience? Where does the fall fit into that?
So now, just so people understand sort of the way in which theodicies operate a lot of the time within analytic philosophy. They are very general in that they do not necessarily take in revealed information. So this theodicy can work, for example, within a Christian framework, but it can also work within an Islamic framework, which might not hold to original sin and hold to the person of Christ. So it's not tied to a specific revealed context, the same way that free will isn't as well. You can use free will within a Christian framework to say, well, free will came from the fall of Adam and Eve, the misuse of free will, evil came from that. But the general way of using free will is a general thing that can be used by different worldviews. So the exemplarist theodicy is general in that it can be utilized and sort of cashed out within the Christian framework. And so you can say that, for example, that suffering is something which was part of our world that God wanted to exist because it brings about the greater good. So in this context, it might not then fit with the idea that suffering was something which happened post-fall. So it might fit within the worldview similar to Hick, that suffering was occurring prior to the fall. So, for example, animal suffering was occurring prior to the fall. But then you could maybe say that human suffering started after the fall. So again, it's open at this moment to how you want to sort of take it within sort of the revealed context we have from the Bible.
You've got options for how to apply
you've got
that.
options. So it doesn't just pigeonhole you into one area. But generally, what it's sort of saying is that, yes, exemplars are key. And where it fits so well is with the person of Christ, because I've sort of in other work sort of showed how even for this to work, you need a supreme exemplar who becomes a human as the person of Christ for everything, to ground all exemplars as they look to that supreme exemplar. So it sort of fits with the idea of the Christian framework that Christ is the one that we all look to as the authentic human.
That's helpful. Can we interact with this comment then? So commentator, discerner, this line of theodicy completely fails and cheapens the meaning of a lot of suffering that adds to no one's character. I think that's really interesting insight. We'll chat about that. It also implies God is incapable of making the best creation without evil. Could we start with that second part of the objection to begin with? Why is it necessary for a God to allow evil? We speak about greater goods. Couldn't God achieve this through means that don't involve evil and suffering. How do you respond to
Yeah,
that
very good.
maybe objection to greater goods
Yeah,
theodicies in
yeah,
general?
yeah. So, well, there's two things here. So, God could create the world without evil, but he wouldn't have the goods that he wants to bring about that are dependent upon the evil. So that's the key thing that I was saying at the beginning. That's good that we actually covered that at the beginning, that
Mm,
in order for something to be a greater good, it has to be necessitated by the suffering, that you couldn't have it without it. So if God wants to have the good of, let's say, making exemplars in his world, who can ground and spread goodness around
yeah.
the world, then suffering is something which is necessary. But God could decide, I don't want to have exemplars. I don't want to do that. And so then he wouldn't require the suffering. And so the argument then would be, you need to show either why God wouldn't want to have that, because maybe there's a disvalue by allowing it. But what I'm trying to argue for is that there's great value in the what type of world that God creates by allowing there to be exemplars in the world that can
Mm.
ground morality and spread goodness around the world. But in order
And
for
will
you
a
to
lot of
have
those judgments sort of rest on your own intuitions as like
that,
you're evaluating?
yeah,
It's almost like the impossibility of imagining something different. You're
yeah,
like you take away these kind of gifts that we
yeah,
have and the experiences and the virtues that are formed through the suffering that we endure in this life.
yeah,
And it's hard for us to imagine a world without those things, but yet the objection sort of wishes
yeah,
that God would bring about just such a world, and in so
yeah,
doing you kind of wish yourself out of existence, right?
yes, yeah, yeah,
Certainly wish our understanding of things out of existence.
yeah,
So certainly that's helpful. What about this first element of the objection though? And I know this is a big feature of yours and you've already discussed it, but maybe if we could apply it. So suffering happens to all of us.
yeah,
Sometimes that suffering seems to have a redemptive influence on our character formation.
yeah,
Other times we, as well as a lot of people, respond to suffering or evils that come our way in ways that are entirely self-destructive, and we grow bitter or angry or overwhelmed by symptoms to a degree where it produces what looks like life-ruining degrees of suffering.
yeah,
So whether it's just the bad reaction to suffering or whether it's actually moving into the horrendous evils category,
yeah.
how, does your theodicy cheapen that sort of experiences maybe this commenter perceives?
No, not at all, because that's why the second criteria is important. So that's why I say that if the person themselves, for whatever reason, doesn't become an exemplar, and that could be because they responded negatively to their suffering, by the fact of them suffering provides others with opportunities. And that might not be just people who are in the immediate vicinity of that person. That could be the parents or, family members. But it could also be people who over time come to know of this case and thus say, you know what, I'm going to be different from that person. I'm going to be like
Mm,
this. And I'm going to respond like that to my suffering in a more positive way. So the idea here is that you need to then show that the person who has that negative sort of reaction to suffering, that they, through just their suffering, doesn't provide opportunities for others to go and become exemplars. So the key
mm,
idea here is that they, even though they might not respond positively, they provide others with the opportunity to do that. But they would
mm,
be compensated by God for that role. So it's not just that
mm,
cheapening it, that God is just saying, okay, I'm just using you as a tool, a means to an end to bring about
mm,
other people's exemplary transformation. But it's that God will actually compensate you for the role that you played because of his goodness. So you, even though you might have responded negatively, because it is, suffering can be something which is very challenging for people, and I completely understand that. They can have a negative response to it. That is a human and completely justified response to a lot of suffering.
mm.
But God will see that, and he, number one, as I will go on to later, he goes through suffering with us. And so there is a connection that you'll have with God that he will make known to you in the future, and that will play the role of the compensatory good. But yeah, I think I'll need to sort of cash out a little bit more in the
Yeah, I know Eleanor Stump leans into that in a
yeah.
big way as well with her sort
Yes,
of loving union kind of stuff.
yes, yeah,
Um, there's an element here that maybe I want to pass out quickly as well then.
yeah,
So this idea that some become exemplars through the suffering that they endure and or become exemplars through watching others go through suffering and providing
yeah.
them the opportunity to serve and grow in virtue and in response to that. Um, is there a line for you where that's enough moral formation to be valuable? Because obviously within even Christian theological frameworks,
Mhm.
at some point our moral exemplar development either plateaus or stops in this life. And there is going to be a moment where we experience the presence of God, and whether it's through the beatic vision, when we see him, we'll be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And that process of moral maturity or moral development obviously is accelerated as our nature is completed. How do you parse that out? Because obviously you've got these kids who will only develop a certain point and then tragically may die early. You've got adults that will make some progress towards the example of Christ, but will not make it all the way.
Yeah.
If they're going to be changed when they meet Jesus in the future anyway, is the necessity of the suffering here necessary, right? Like I guess that's what I don't know if I'm
Yeah,
articulating this well enough. It's sort
yeah.
of like what's the point of moral development if we get developed when we see Jesus anyway? Why don't we just get zapped out of existence? Or do you see the telling of God's story in this way and our role in forming the world as a good in and of itself, irrespective of maybe its material, like its final telos or end?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a very good question. That's why I focus on this idea of creative flourishing. So the transformation to an exemplar isn't for ourselves as such. It's for the betterment of others and the world, because we are
Mm,
grounds of morality, and we are the
mm,
ones who spread goodness around the world. So, and this is quite where I'm a bit different from Hicks. So the reason I didn't favor Hicks' approach, which seems similar to mine but is quite different, is because his sort of developmental process doesn't really have anything for others. Like, it's just for
mm.
me to become soulmate,
Yeah.
soul like God. And so when people just don't become like God, and they will in the future, that applies completely. But the idea here is that we have a role to play. Every single human being has a role to play in this world, and this could be someone who is the most gifted, intellectually, aesthetically, or the person who isn't, or the person who is the most wealthiest, or the person who isn't. But every person has a role to play in being a creative agent within God's
Mm.
world,
I
because
really
by
like that
your yeah
theologically.
yeah because by your response to, and this is, and I delivered this in a school as well, and I was trying to say, and this was off camera, it was felt unbelievable, but I was trying to say that in your school you can be exemplars of morality. Like, when that bully comes to take someone, and treat someone badly, and you stand up to that bully and you say, no, that's not right, and you respond in a right and virtuous way towards those sort of things you find in a difficult schooling environment, you are an exemplar of morality, and you're grounding morality within your context. So people
Mm,
look to you, this is a good person. And also, you spread goodness by the way you are living. And so in every context, every small or large context, you have the possibility to be a creative force for God within this world.
mm,
And so
mm,
even if you're cut off, and that person, unfortunately, the child that gets cut off, his suffering is going to play a role in enabling others to take. It's like they pass on the baton, that they weren't themselves able to complete the race, but they pass on the baton to someone else to complete that race and become good, and
mm,
allow God's world to become good, and to be to have an axiologically positive reality, instead of one that's negative. And
mm.
so yeah, I mean, for example, sorry, this is something that popped in my head, but we look at people, for example, in World War II that stood up to Nazism. No one will go and look and say they shouldn't have done that. Like, they should have just allowed Nazism to go about. And they lost
Mm,
their lives. They lost their lives because of that. But what they did was they were standing up for what was good, what was right. And so they, through their life and through their sacrifices, grounded goodness and spread goodness through their actions. And so the idea here is that if we don't, become exemplars of morality, and we allow those who are exemplars of evil to become sort of prevalent within society, then unfortunately we're going to have a society that's not going to be very good. So the idea
mm.
here is that I believe that even though the process might be fully realized for myself in the future, just by me living an exemplary life, I'm grounding goodness within my context that's going to have reverberations throughout reality that I might
Mm.
not be able to even notice until I get into
It
the other.
just seems like such a profoundly meaningful story then, doesn't
Yeah,
it? Like it
yeah,
just, there's a lot intuitively that resonates with me here, and,
yeah,
and maybe people have a different experience as you cash this out.
yeah,
But certainly for me, I'm like, there's a
yeah,
lot of resonance with what you're saying, and the way that the
yeah,
Christian story has this picture of us finally being the gardeners and governors of the new creation
yes,
alongside Jesus, and the role that
yeah,
we're meant to play as his agents in the world. And I
yeah,
just think there's a lot that
yeah,
fits well with even the revelation of the Christian story. Like you said, your
yeah,
theodicy is abstracted from it. It can stand on
yeah,
its own simply
yeah,
from lived experience and background
yes,
knowledge, but
yeah,
it has a lot of resonance
yeah.
with the themes of the Christian story as well.
And yeah, and can I just say one thing? So someone who's been very influential in my thinking is Tom Wright, so NT Wright, and so
Mm,
his sort of idea of that we are the new creation. So the new creation doesn't just start when Christ consummates his creation within his second coming, but it started through the launching of the new creation by his life, death, and resurrection. And so we as Christians are now within this reality, which is sinful and laden with sin. We are the new creation, and we are in a way working for God's kingdom through our living.
mm,
And so ties in with that idea as well, that, well, through you living an exemplar, you are living the life of the way in which God created us to be. And so
Totally.
we are living as the way we were supposed to be from the beginning, as exemplars for goodness. And so it sort of fits in with that sort of idea as well. I think, yeah, there might be some overlap.
Yeah, really natural. I love
Yeah.
that. So let's dive then maybe to the two big questions that
Yes.
everyone will have, because I know we've only got very limited time to let you get
Yeah.
out of here. The whole nature then of what is often termed horrendous evils, or these evils that on the face of it seem so evidentially powerful as defeaters of God. You can't see any reason from our vantage point as to why a good God may let these things happen. It doesn't seem to produce the kind of greater goods from our perspective that we might want to see for it to be morally justified for God to allow it. How does your theory, your theodicy, kind of make sense of horrendous evils?
Okay. Yeah. So there's sort of two things here. And sorry, could I actually just ask you to
Yeah,
put up the
absolutely.
PowerPoint again, and then I'll just yeah, if you just go a little bit more forward. Yeah, sorry,
You
just
tell
still
me
go.
when.
Yeah, I'll tell you when to stop. Still go forward and blah, blah, blah.
Transformation.
Yeah. So it should be, yeah, sorry, a little bit more solution. Oh, sorry, go back. Sorry, I can't even read my own
That's
stuff.
okay.
Solution 2, sorry, just keep on going back. Sorry,
Solution 2.
yeah,
That's good.
yeah, that one there. Okay, so I'll go on to this in a second, but I'm going to just say one thing before I go into this. So, the idea of the severity of suffering is something that I deal with in the theodicy of saying, well, we can see how maybe this works, that there is suffering that allows us to become exemplars or provide others with the opportunity to become exemplars. But why so much suffering, or why suffering that is so intense? So that's sort of where horrendous suffering falls in. You have such meaning destroying suffering, that why would God allow that? Now, there's sort of one thing I want to say before I go on to this point, which is, it sounds weird, but there's a counterintuitive idea here with exemplarism, because the more you suffer, the greater your admirability increases. So the more suffering that you've gone through, the more admirable that you are. So, for example, if I'm someone who just stubs my leg all the time and I go around just with silly bad things that happen to me, okay, maybe you might people say, oh, good, he's not cursing, he's not getting angry, okay, but it's not really going to be that great. If I'm someone who has, let's say, cancerous illness, and I look and I go through that with patience and courage and kindness still, and I'm someone who still just keeps on holding towards what goodness is, people are going to look at that and say, that's a very admirable person. But let's say you even put this higher, and let's say we look at people that went through the Holocaust and they survived it, and they were loving towards even those people who were breaking them down and treating them like they were animals. But they were still kind and patient. And the way they've come through this, let's say they survived it, and they've been people of courage and heroic. We look to them and we'll say, even that person seems to even be more admirable. Their scales of admirability, the stubbing toe one is at the bottom level. The person who battles cancer and is courageous is great. The person who is courageous and worked through that and loving and wasn't broken down through the Holocaust is even more admirable. And so the idea here is that you have this counterintuitive idea that the more suffering that the person's gone through, the more admirable they are, the greater the exemplar that they are. But then also a second thing related to this is that the more motivating force that there is for emulation. So the more intense suffering that the person has gone through, the more I'm going to be motivated to be like them. Because I would say, if they were like that when they were kind and peaceful and loving, but they were treated in that way, how much more me, who's going through something that is not as maybe bad as this? So look at the person of Christ. We would say that was a horrendous suffering. But how was he responding to his suffering? He responded with saying, Father, please forgive them, for they do not know. He didn't curse as any other person would have, but he was peaceful and kind and compassionate towards those people, even through his horrendous suffering. And so why that motivates us to say, if Christ was able to be like that, carry his cross, we are to do that the same thing in the smaller context. So the idea here is that why God will allow intense suffering like a horrendous suffering, again, might not necessarily be for the person who is going through the suffering, though they will be compensated for that. But it's because it's going to firstly increase their admirability and also increase the motivating force for their emulation, that others will look to that and say, we can overcome our suffering in any context because that person was able to do such a thing in that specific context that they're in. So that's one thing I would say. But then the second thing as well is this additional thing, which is on the PowerPoint here, which is a new thing that I didn't have in the paper. But it's something I also brought up in my unbelievable conversation with Stephen Law, but it was just at the end, so we weren't able to go through in depth. But okay, so first thing that I want to define is the idea of omnisubjectivity. So there is this idea that Linda Zibzewski, again, discovered, not invented, I'll say she discovered, about the nature of God. Because normally we define God and say that God is all-powerful, he's omnipotent, all-powerful, he's all-knowing. That means he knows of the truth value of any proposition. So he knows any fact, basically. But then there is something that Zibzewski said, that God can't just be omniscient, that he knows the facts of everything. But there is also something that's lacking if God just knows things from a third person perspective, that he knows of the experiences of me. He knows that Josh is talking now. He knows that Josh will stand up and drink some water. So he knows all these facts. But it's very different from me actually speaking and me actually drinking the water. So the experiential fact of me going through something is very different from someone who's observing do this. So she said that in order for God to be cognitively perfect, he needs to have the additional attribute of be omnisubjective. That means he needs to know what it's like to be whatever a conscious being is from their own first person perspective. So he needs to know what my feelings are in this moment, what I'm thinking of in this moment, like he is me. So from my first person perspective. And why God will need to do that is because, for example, many things that we act upon cannot really be known from an objective standpoint, but are known from the experiential standpoint. So if God is going to be a judge of me, he's going to have to know everything about me, and even from my own first person perspective. So anyways, the idea here is that God, to be cognitively perfect, he would need to know and be able to live my life through me. So he knows what it's like to be Josh. He experiences everything that I experience. He experiences everything that you, Dan, experience. He experiences everything that even an animal experiences, because that is a conscious being. So given that God has omnisubjectivity, let's now apply this to suffering. So God experiences every single suffering event with us. Every single suffering event that I experience, God has experienced it like he himself is going through this. And so the idea here is that there is nothing that, and no suffering experience that God hasn't himself gone through. But we have to say that God goes through this from a perspective of knowing that this is not him. So this is modeled upon empathy. So the same way that I can empathize with someone who's going through suffering, and I can feel the feelings that they're going through in a very robust sense, I still know that these are not my feelings. They're Tom's feelings and not mine. So the idea here is that God has total empathy with every cognitive agent, every conscious being. Okay. And that means that he empathizes with us through all of our suffering. Now, I then thought about this idea. Well, there are various virtues that we have that God cannot possess. So, for example, God cannot be courageous. God cannot. Because in order to be courageous, you have to fear. You have to fear loss. So, for example, if I run into a burning building, the reason why I'm courageous is because I'm fearing, or people fearing around me, that I'm going to injure myself. God cannot, because he's omnipotent. He will never be able to experience loss. So God cannot be courageous. God can also not be patient, because anything that God wants is given to him immediately. There's not even a temporal sequence between God thinking of something and him having it. So he doesn't ever have to exemplify patience. He actually cannot be patient. So the idea here is, and also compassion as well, which is interesting. So there are various virtues that God cannot have, but we can have. But we would want to say that God is the greatest exemplar. We would want to say, let's say I'm an exemplar, and you're an exemplar, Dan, and Mother Teresa is an exemplar, and there's all these exemplars within reality. We would want to say, however, that God himself is the supreme exemplar, because he is the definition of what it is to be good. But in order for God to be the supreme exemplar, he needs to have all the virtues that make an exemplar good. So the virtues that I have, God needs to have. Because if he's going to be the supreme exemplar, that he is a standard of good universally for every created being, then every created being who's going to have their virtues of goodness, he would need to have them in some form. So the idea here is that because God is omnisubjective, he experiences all of our suffering. And that means that he also has the opportunity to manifest all the virtues that we have. So the same way that I am feeling fear, God feels fear. But let's say I am courageous in that act of me feeling fear, God also can manifest through me that courage. So just the last thing here now. So this is then where the second tenet of the theodicy comes in, that God permits suffering because it enables others to transform into exemplars. But this also, I didn't define who the others are. This includes created beings, but also God himself. That through our suffering, God becomes the supreme exemplar because he experiences the suffering with us and thus is able to acquire all of the virtues that we have within our limitations. So he's able to have courage in the context of Josh. He's able to have courage in the context of Dan. He's able to have compassion. So he has all of these things that are given to him, but through his experiencing suffering with us. So by me suffering, I'm also contributing not to others becoming exemplars, but God also manifesting virtues that he is able to be the supreme exemplar. So this then applies to every single suffering experience. So even if there is someone who is going through the Holocaust, for example, or going through a really horrendous suffering, who is not able to, who's broken down by this suffering, and there is not other people that are going to transform, by God experiencing that with that person, he's manifesting the virtue that is needed or would be virtuous in that specific context. So God is able to himself transform within every act of suffering into the supreme exemplar because of his divine omnisubjectivity. So I don't know, that's a lot there just thrown in your face, Dan. I don't know.
Yeah, it's certainly a new concept for me, and I'm sitting here, and whenever I hear something new, you always start thinking, but what about,
Yes,
how does it fit with this? And that's kind of this role, particularly of like analytic philosophy of religion,
Yes.
is you're trying to say, oh, here are these new resources, how does that fit with anything else?
Yeah.
Does this produce a coherent story, or does it introduce contradictions or major concerns? I mean, it's going to be fun watching that cash out as that gets out there, and people start responding as to, you know, does this imply God needs something from creation? Is this a lack in God's divine nature in some way? So there's some really interesting kind of questions there. We haven't got a lot of time. There's two things I really want to ask, just maybe applying this. How then does this speak to the experience of animals? Because animal suffering has been a particular concern for someone like Alex O'Connor as a sort of figurehead atheist of the newer breed online, and many other skeptical thinkers have said, okay, most theodicies appeal to some kind of divine compensation, like for this type 2 sufferer, the ones who don't seem to benefit by themselves becoming exemplars. You can still say, well, God can compensate them in eternity within some kind of vision of an afterlife or divine relations, because they've experienced his sufferings and are able to partake in that. But what about for non-human animals, where I mean, some Christians want to argue that maybe their soulish nature means they will experience an afterlife, or they do have soul development or something like that. But I'm curious as to what your application is for your
Exactly. Yeah. So I applied the theodicy in exactly the same way to animals. So the same thing that you say to the human suffering, you say to the animal suffering. So you say that why God permits animal suffering is because either firstly, it allows the animal to transform into an exemplar, or secondly, it provides other animals with the opportunity to transform into exemplars. Now, the only pushback that someone can give is, well, what grounds do we have that animals can transform into exemplars? And so what I argue for, and this is based upon a lot of research on cognitive ethology. If we actually move on, I could show just very quickly. Is it possible if you just keep on skipping forward, and I'll just tell you where to stop. Okay.
There was an animal bit.
If you just go one more, just there. So
sorry, back.
Sorry, just back there. So there's been great work that's been done in this field called cognitive ethology, which is basically the study of animal minds. And unfortunately, a lot of philosophy of religion and also Christian apologetics hasn't taken into account any of the data that's been put forward in cognitive ethology. And the majority of cognitive ethologists believe two things. Firstly, they believe that animals are moral beings. So they have the status of something called moral subjects, that they can act upon and they have moral emotions. emotions. So they can be compassionate and empathetic and patient and all those sort of things that we see as virtuous that humans have, animals have it. And so if someone wants a fact check, go and look up the work, Can Animals Be Moral by Mark Rowlands, published by Oxford University Press. And there's various other people that have defended similar lines. And so they've argued that firstly, animals could have a moral status. So it's a very outdated idea that animals cannot be moral. That's not something that most cognitive ethologists argue for. They say based upon, I would say, tons and tons of data, we can see that animals show moral emotions and they act upon those moral emotions. And then secondly, it's also the cognitive robustness that animals have. A lot of the times people have a incorrect understanding of animal minds, but actually there is many, again, and I've just sort of listed some stuff here, but there are many areas of animal cognition that have shown that animals have very similar type of minds to humans. If you actually, just take one step back with the PowerPoint. I'll just show something here. So, for example, Mark Rowlands, again, he has a book called "Can Animals Be Persons?" and that was published by Oxford University Press. And he argues for, and a lot of people have argued for, again, that animals have at least four conditions of personhood. They have consciousness, they have cognition, they have self-awareness, they have other awareness. So all the sort of things that we take humans to have, animals have the ability to have as well. So then the burden's on the atheist to say, why cannot this theodicy be applied to animals as well? Why cannot animals actually become exemplars of morality? And if you take the approach that I'm taking, that God wants us as created beings to ground morality within his context, then we have a very good grounds to say that God will not just want to limit this exemplarist process to the limited time span of humans, which was only 200,000 years, but he'll want to have his sort of exemplarist framework working from the beginning of the times of when we've had cognitive agents. So why cannot animals have this sort of process? Now, some people might be saying, well, this just seems to be far-fetched. Can we just take a few slides forward, just to show something as well? Sorry. So there's been great work. Wild Justice. So there's been great work by these two people, again, cognitive ethologists called Mark Beckhoff and Jessica Pearson. The work is actually called Wild Justice, where they've actually said that we have great amount of data that shows that animals have a species-specific morality. So what a lot of people try to understand is that, in order for animals to be moral, they need to be like human beings. No, that's not true. Morality in sort of philosophy is something which is a supervenient term, so it's dependent upon the context. And so what animals are, when they're moral, they're moral within their species context. And so what we can see, though, from the data is that there are at least 3 clusters of moral behavior that animals show. They show cooperation, they show empathy, and they try to uphold justice within their societies. So my idea here is that animals become exemplars relative to those clusters. So they become exemplars relative to the cooperation cluster. They become exemplars relative to the empathy cluster, and they become exemplars relative to the justice cluster. But again, all of those things require suffering in order for those things to be exemplified, to be manifested in each of those clusters. So the idea here is that if we have all this data that firstly, animals can be moral, and then secondly, animals have the robust cognitive faculties to be able to do the things that exemplarism will require, like emulation, then we have the idea here that animals can have the same thing, that they can ground what it means to be good, to be a cooperative being, to be an empathetic being, to be a just being within their specific species context, and they can spread that goodness by their actions. So then God is also allowing them to have a role within the creative role that God has. Not just, your animal isn't just a automative being like Descartes believed, with a sort of a soul, a ghost in a machine, but the animal actually has robust moral status that plays a role in also grounding goodness in God's world. And so why wouldn't God allow that sort of great creative flourishing to also be made available for the animals, like it is for us as human animals? So my pushback would be, it's on the burden of the atheist to go and say why my criteria doesn't apply, because given the vast amount of data that we have good reasons to believe that animals can be exemplars. And this is not just myself as well. There's a paper, if I'm correct with the person's name, Anna Corsten, again, not a theist, who argues for animal exemplarity. So this is not something that I'm just picking out out of thin air, but I'm saying actually this can apply to the idea of animal suffering. And just one last thing, so I want to push back on one thing. You hear a lot of people who are atheists online using the evolutionary argument for suffering, for animal suffering. But again, that's a really outdated idea in the cognitive ethology work. I would say to everyone, go and read that book again, Wild Justice, and they turn this this idea on its head by actually saying that the data that we have doesn't show that evolution is a violent mechanism. It actually is a lot more affiliative. So in order for evolution to work, there has to be a lot of cooperation, a lot of empathy, a lot of justice that is playing around in the animal kingdom. But what happens a lot of the time is that the news, like it does in sort of the human context,
spotlights all of the suffering.
Yeah, they never show the guy helping the old lady across the road, but they show the person shooting someone because that sells the news. And that's the same thing with documentaries and all these sort of things. And so they really pick this out and say, actually, what we've studied from the data, the animal kingdom, for evolution to work, you need cooperation. It's not red in tooth and claw. It's actually a lot more. They use the term the snuggle of existence rather than the struggle of existence, because a lot more cooperation and affiliative behavior, altruistic behavior, is needed for evolution to work. So actually, this idea of evolution being so negative isn't what is grounded a lot upon the data that we have here. Sorry, it's a very short.
That's so helpful
to go into, but yeah.
Mate, that's so helpful just as a window, and maybe we can do a follow-up in future when particularly once this gets published, and then all of the questions start coming in where you can do clarifications and pushbacks and maybe wrestle with some of the text and scripture as well. Mate, let me close because I know you need to get out of here. Just with a question maybe a bit more grounded. Having studied and spent so much time wrestling with theodicy, how would you speak to someone who's suffering now? So someone's watching this and they're wrestling with, man, I'm struggling to believe in God because of what's playing out in my life. Is there a dimension of wisdom that flows from this on what to do in that moment if you're finding it hard to trust God? What kind of application point would you give?
Yeah, so I think I will give any advice with trepidation, because as I'm in the same situation of questioning and going through the challenge of life with suffering. I mean, it's something that we experience on a daily basis, and even if it's not directly happening to me at this moment, it potentially will happen, and I see it happening throughout the world. And when I watch the news, so I can all just show empathy and compassion towards that person, and I don't want anyone to ever think that I'm in an ivory tower just stroking my very short beard compared to yours, which is very nice. But that I'm sort of just trying to come up with this idea to get God off the hook. It's not like that. And theodicy as well is very theoretical, and unfortunately it's not as practical as it needs to be. But one thing I really like about this exemplarism is that it has played a role in my life of saying, when I'm actually facing an evil or a suffering, or just even something like my daughter's not listening to me after the 25th time of saying and
brother, I hear you.
And but that is an opportunity to be an exemplar, because I can either respond with patience or I can just get angry. But the more I respond with patience, as human nature is like, the more you become like that thing. The same way, like, the more you lie, the more you become into a liar. But the more you become patient, the more you become a patient individual. You become that virtue. And so I just really like this, in that you have things like free will, and you're like, okay, that's great, but how does that actually really apply to me? Great, I have free will, okay, but it's not really come to me. But it's actually saying, I actually have a potential role that I can play here that's going to change my living circumstance, because I can be the ground of morality within my family context, and then in my wider community context. And then let's say you have the opportunity that God might give you into the wider public context of actually being an exemplar that's going to ground morality for God and be used as a tool for furthering God's kingdom. So the way I just like this is that it seems to have a practical aspect of saying, even if this doesn't solve the problem of evil, it seems to have something good in it, that it seems to allow people to see that actually it's good to be good, because you're gonna have a role to play. And it doesn't matter if you have money, it doesn't matter if you have anything that the world sees as being a positive thing. You have, by your faculties that God has given you, the ability to be able to be good, and that's going to have a lot more effect over time than you will ever know.
And I appreciate that. I think this is a deeply practical application from your theodicy, because as much as you're trying to say, can I trust that God is good? And I think there are resources with the cross that speak into that profoundly. You're also saying, well, you've got to make a choice as you suffer. And there may be some instances that are beyond your control, but the majority of suffering, you can either choose to let this destroy you and you can be deformed by it, or you can form yourself into a moral exemplar by how you lean into and respond to this suffering. And it almost puts that nature of, Romans 8:28, where it says, for those who love God and are called according to his purpose, he works together all things for good. And it's part of it is learning to trust in and trust God and lean into him and the vision that he has for your life, who he wants you to become in the midst of your suffering, to actually receive it as a trial that can produce perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. To participate in that, the end game, it depends somewhat on how you choose to respond in those moments. So I do think that's actually something that is a bit of a call to action in the middle of suffering. Consider who you want to be at the end of that process and make decisions accordingly, even as you face the suffering that comes. So, mate, thank you so much for the time that you've given just to unfold that as a window into the current state of your exemplarist theodicy. And it's a cool thing about these theodicies is they develop with time and with objection and interaction, and there'll be various iterations into the future. So I look forward to seeing how that continues to grow for you. Mate, I'll make sure to put all of the links to your academic work down in the show notes so people can check you out a little bit further. But just want to say thanks for coming on the live stream today.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. Just one last thing. I don't know if there's any questions anyone might have left. I don't want to leave people think with a question that they might not be able to answer and say, oh, goodness.
I didn't see anything in there as of yet that we haven't covered in the questions in the chat. So there's some great chat going on between different people, as is always the case. But as people send in questions too, maybe we could start
they can
them
always.
up and we could
I'm more than
Q&A
happy. Anyone who wants to contact me via email, Facebook, I'm more than happy to answer any questions. But thank you so much.
It might be great to get you back for a general Q&A episode that covers a lot more of the breadth of your work as well, because particularly in some of the key areas that are being questioned around the nature of Christ's divinity, and I think there are areas that are really fascinating for analytic sort of philosophers and theologians to get involved in. So, well, thanks so much for jumping on.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
That's great. Well, thanks for watching to the end here. If you're new to the channel, please make sure you like and subscribe and share away anyone who you think this might be helpful. If you want to get in contact, www.questioningchristianity.com tells you everything about the nature of what we do. And if you want to help keep the lights on around here and help us producing great content, of bringing on experts and answering many of the questions people send in to us, you can find out how to support and be part of the ministry there on the website. Until next time, truth invites questioning. We'll see you later.